It was just a routine Monday night on patrol. It's the first night of a long week for us. I heard Deputy Knight come across the radio that she was attempting to conduct a traffic stop. And I could immediately tell there was something wrong with her voice.
They had a gun, they were shooting at my windshield.
I'm trying to think, I need to get there, I need to catch up, I need to get there.
We just got hit, we just got hit. I returned fire.
I caught up to the rear of the pursuit, and that's the first time I laid eyes on him. My heart starts racing. All I could see was the bright muzzle flash coming at me.
They got an AR-15 shooting out the passenger side.
We're not just out here chasing bad guys, we're getting shot at.
I remember that's the first thought I had, that we're kind of dealing with a potential modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. They were just two people who met, and two people that a lot of folks wish would never have met, and they were just intended on evil, and that's what they acted out, was evil.
On May 14th, 2021, the Great Falls Police Department in Chester County, South Carolina, receives a concerning phone call from local resident Eldrick Simpson.
Chester County Dispatch.
Yes, ma'am. We have received my cousin saying maybe he has called us. He has been around.
When was the last time you saw him?
May the 2nd.
Okay.
Eugene used to come to the house every day, but it was like 4 days in a row he didn't came. So then we start calling around trying to find out, hey, have you seen Eugene? Anybody seen Gino? Where is he?
I feel like something's happened to Gene. There's no way he went this long and he ain't talked to his family. Chief Benson from Great Falls. He just asked, when was the last time we seen Gene? Where would we think he might be at? Trying to figure out what was going on. He didn't show up for the kids' cookout, and it was just, weird.
Kids got worried. I got worried. So now things getting real sketchy now.
Eugene's family tells authorities they're unable to reach Eugene's wife, Adrienne.
I just thought Gene was gone missing with Adrienne.
And that's when we put out a missing report.
Eugene Simpson was a lifelong resident of Chester County.
Back in our childhood, we used to run around and play around a lot. And Eugene was the oldest. So Eugene was the person who we followed.
By middle school, Eugene showed a talent for both football and basketball.
When Eugene get the ball, man, Eugene had moves that we ain't ever seen before. He was just so talented and so fast.
After high school, Eugene was known for being industrious and hardworking.
I would describe him as jack of all trades. Gene was gifted. He was talented. He could draw, he could cut hair, he could cut grass, he could build you a house. Gene was just very unique.
Eugene used to cut hair everywhere. He walked around with his book bag on, slippers in his bag. But Gene never had a real job, like a paycheck every week. He was working maybe like side job, laying bricks or cutting grass, making a living.
It was in those early post-high school years that Eugene began dating a former classmate named Adrienne.
Adrienne, she went to the same school with her, and they eventually met each other and fell in love with each other. They were 17, 18.
Adrienne was also born and raised in Chester.
Our parents divorced when we were young, but I think me and Adrienne had a loving household, playing outside like normal kids. Grades were good friends in high school. Adrienne, she was popular with the boys. She'd have a boyfriend this week and maybe another one a different time later, She's never really had no one steady for a while. I would say till she met Gene.
The young couple had an instant connection, and married in 2011 after several months of dating.
Jean was telling her, I'm finna have a baby, y'all.
Adrienne and Jean's first kid, Jasmine, came April of 2011, and as soon as she had her, she had pictures taken of Jasmine and sent everybody the newborn picture with Jasmine dressed up, you know.
Adrienne and Jean actually had a house together, and they tried their best to be two young adults taking care of their first child.
Less than 2 years later, their son, Elijah, was born.
Eugene, he loved his kids. I'm talking about love his kids to death. Eugene wanted to be a family man and have a happy life.
Anytime you would talk to Adrienne, it was always, I'm trying to do this for my kids, you know, post about I love my kids.
Investigators learned from Eugene's family that Eugene and his wife, Adrienne, had been going through a rough patch after 10 years of marriage.
Adrienne, she was trying her best with the kids and getting kind of frustrated because Eugene started doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. Gino had a bad addiction problem and was starting to struggle real bad.
Adrienne contacted me and said, you know, she needed help with the place to stay. So we let her and her 2 kids, Jasmine and Elijah, move in with us. And she worked on getting a low-income based apartment.
Adrienne left Eugene because Adrienne was trying to get her life back situated with herself, but Eugene wasn't. Some days he going through his demon mode.
Adrienne and Jean never actually were divorced. They'd just been separated for several years. And then Jean ended up coming to Salisbury at one period of time. So they were going to try to work it out, I reckon. Just the trust with one another didn't work. So, you know, he ended up going back to Great Falls.
With Eugene and Adrienne both missing, authorities must determine if their relationship problems had led to their disappearances.
We knew that something had happened, and we were trying to hope for the best, but you just want to know now, like, where's he at? What happened?
Coming up, the discovery of a body creates more fear in a small town.
There was 4 gunshot wounds around the heart.
And investigators uncover a twisted romance that sparked violence.
The relationship had taken a bad turn.
She was jealous over those 2.
Investigators in Chester, South Carolina are searching for 33-year-old Eugene Simpson and his estranged wife, Adrienne. Several hours into the investigation, authorities in neighboring York County receive a call about another missing person.
A 911 call had come into the York County Dispatch from Shamira Hicks, who was concerned about her friend, Thomas Harden. Thomas Harden, we understand, was trans and used both male and female pronouns.
According to Shamira, she hasn't spoken to Thomas all day. This call came in about 8:30 in the evening.
It was a well-being check. The police had been called and asked if they would go by and just look in on him and make sure that he was all right.
When the officer arrives at Thomas's apartment, the front door is ajar.
The officers opened the door. The door hit something on the floor. The officer looks down and notices the body of Thomas Harden laying on his back in the foyer of the house.
He had been shot to death. 9mm shell casings were found on the floor.
There was 4 gunshot wounds to the left chest of Thomas around the heart and an apparent gunshot wound to the chin area.
So at that point, it became a homicide investigation, and they sealed off the scene and began looking for pieces of evidence.
I was able to look throughout the apartment. Nothing appeared to have been tampered with or taken. So that tells me right off the bat that it wasn't a robbery. Without a robbery occurring, to me, indicates Thomas more than likely would have known the assailant. This was a personal crime, maybe a crime of passion.
Outside, investigators find a possible clue.
While canvassing the area, I was approached by a neighbor who lived next to Thomas, and stated that he was mowing his lawn earlier that day and located a credit card.
The debit card had the name Adrienne Simpson on it.
After looking up the name Adrienne Simpson, York investigators learned she and her husband Eugene have been reported missing in Chester County.
And we knew at that moment that we were looking for connections between those crimes.
Investigators interview Thomas's circle, hoping to find any link between Thomas and Adrienne.
I reached back out to some family and friends of Thomas to try to gain more of a perspective of Thomas's home life and who he associated with.
When I first met Thomas, he moved into the neighborhood, and I lived across the street from him. He was the type of person that stayed to himself. He didn't get out much because he worked mainly all the time, but he was a quiet person. He worked at Bojangles. He at one time said he wanted to open up his own chicken restaurant, and I was like, that's good, you know. We had our times where we would just sit on the front porch and he'd play the radio and we'd just sit there and laugh and cut up. And we'd talk about, you know, his work and his lifestyle.
There was no secret that Thomas liked male companions.
According to Thomas's friends and family, one man in particular had been a regular companion, Tyler Terry.
Both family and friends mentioned Tyler Terry as an on-again, off-again relationship.
When I first met Tyler, he seemed to be a good guy. We'd sit out in the yard and we would talk and laugh and cut up. Thomas really had a hate-love relationship. They were in a relationship at one time. Thomas decided it wasn't what he wanted.
They just made it clear that it was a very unhealthy relationship between Thomas and Tyler. I was able to find a couple of domestic disputes between Thomas and Tyler.
The relationship between Tyler Terry and Thomas Harden had taken a bad turn.
The crime reports on Tyler Terry also show an intriguing link to Adrienne Simpson.
What really gauged my interest was I was able to find some reports involving a Tyler Terry and an Adrienne Simpson in a couple of domestic violence reports. Once I gained those reports, it was learned that Adrienne Simpson was a girlfriend of Tyler Terry's, and it does show a pattern on Tyler's end of domestic violence history.
Investigators theorize that Tyler Terry may be the connection between the disappearances of Adrienne and Eugene and the death of Thomas Harden.
After finding reports between Tyler and Adrienne with domestic violence and also the on-again, off-again relationship between Thomas and Tyler, our investigation really focused on Tyler. He is high on my suspect list.
May 2021. Chester County, South Carolina investigators have discovered missing person Adrienne Simpson and murder victim Thomas Harden were both dating a man named Tyler Terry. Investigators dig deeper into Tyler Terry's background.
Once I established Tyler as a main person of interest in this case, I looked into his background, his criminal history, his past associates.
Law enforcement determined that he was from around Lenore, North Carolina, and also spent some time living on the street.
Tyler had several arrests in the past with some violent tendencies with assault and domestic violence. To me, this does show that he does have a pattern.
Investigators contact Adrienne's family, who confirm a volatile relationship.
Adrienne and Tyler met around like 2018. They were together a few years. Adrienne really loved Tyler Terry.
Tyler and Adrienne met through friends, and Adrienne, again, was still married to Eugene. They were not living together at the time, but Adrienne and Tyler started seeing each other and became an item.
He was very abusive to her from the beginning. One time, Adrienne called me. She said Tyler Terry had beat her while she was asleep with the belt. Adrienne had whips all on her back. Her eye was black at the time. He busted her eardrum. He pulled a gun on her. There's incidents where he pulled a machete on her.
According to family members, Adrienne still remained devoted to Tyler.
She couldn't leave him alone. I didn't understand. I don't know what kind of hold. She couldn't leave him alone.
I would say Adrienne quit paying the bills, and focused on Tyler Terry. Adrienne ended up losing her apartment. Adrienne and Gene shared custody, so the kids ended up with Gene's family.
They were living from motel to motel. So me and my wife had Eugene kids on and off.
I can't tell you why Adrienne would, pick being homeless and staying with Tyler Terry instead of trying to give her kids a good life. I think she thought he really loved her. I'm not sure if he really loved her or just felt that he had this control over her.
Since Tyler was also involved with Thomas Harden at the same time, investigators asked Adrienne's family if they knew of any animosity between Adrienne and Thomas.
Adrienne and Tyler were in a relationship, and Adrienne knew that every time that they would be on the outs is when Tyler would then go back to Thomas.
Adrienne was jealous over those two. Adrienne wanted to be with Tyler Terry.
With new information about Adrienne and Tyler, investigators wonder if she could be involved in both Thomas Harden's death and her estranged husband Eugene's disappearance.
There was hopes he would turn out alive, but we all really thought the worst had already happened.
Learning about Tyler's criminal history and his past violent tendencies, isn't afraid to harm anybody. So I was working with Chester County authorities. I submitted several subpoenas and search warrants for both Tyler's and Adrienne's cell phone records, any financial institution records, see if they were using any debit card locations, maybe be able to track down where they might be at. But neither one of them was using a debit card or credit card.
Then, on May 17th, investigators get a call. A couple matching Adrienne and Tyler's description have just been spotted in downtown Chester.
The vehicle was sitting in a dark parking lot of a business that was closed.
Suspicious vehicle, Bojangles.
Deputy Knight was checking to see if they were going to break into the Bojangles or what they were doing. It was just a routine night on patrol, and I heard Deputy Knight come across the radio that she was attempting to conduct a traffic stop. And I could immediately tell there was something wrong with her voice.
As she attempted to approach that vehicle, the vehicle sped off. And she gave chase.
I was awakened by a phone call. I was informed that Chester County Sheriff's deputies were just involved in a car chase where the suspect was shooting at them.
Coming up, a high-speed chase endangers the lives of local law enforcement.
You hear shots fired, more shots fired.
And I just started yelling at people to go inside, lock the door.
And with a killer on the loose, terror sweeps the nation as the body count rises.
It was almost like he was a ghost and couldn't be caught. We're dealing with a potential modern-day Bonnie and Clyde.
On the night of May 17th, 2021, authorities are in pursuit of a couple matching the description of Adrienne Simpson and Tyler Terry.
They had a gun, they were shooting at my windshield. You got the shots fired, law enforcement. 10-4.
Within the first few hundred yards, someone shot at her from that vehicle. And that bullet hit the windshield of her car. Her supervisor was across the street getting gas, and he observed what happened. He immediately got in his vehicle and became involved in the chase.
And you paid all available county units. 10-4. Shots fired.
I heard shots fired. I was at least 2 minutes away. I positioned myself to try to get in the chase
I was driving as fast as I possibly could. The whole time coming down towards Chester, you hear shots fired, more shots fired, more shots fired. So I need to catch up. I need to get there.
There were multiple shots fired by the assailant in the vehicle. Biddy Branham actually did return fire a few times as he drove in his vehicle, shooting through his windshield with his rifle.
I'm visible, I'm not struck. I have returned fire. They have got an AR-15 shoot out the passenger side.
And I caught up towards the rear of the pursuit. And that's the first time I laid eyes on them, and they were in the left-hand lane in oncoming traffic. All I could see was the bright muzzle flash coming at me. I was scared.
The high-speed chase tears through the center of downtown Chester.
We go through the city limits, and we went through some hooks and curves, and, they were still engaging gunfire.
It's very difficult as you're being shot at to anticipate those turns that he would make.
The high-speed chase continues onto a major highway.
It felt like I got shot at over 100 times. I was able to do everything I needed to do, match speeds, made contact, and they crashed off into the median.
So when that vehicle stops, all of those deputies involved in the chase, immediately weapons are drawn, they approach the vehicle.
I immediately began yelling at them to show me their hands. I observed a male subject get out of the vehicle. He ran towards the rear and was running up the embankment into the wood lines. He had a pretty good head start on me.
He was still armed, was running up the hill.
My thought was, if I run after him and I go up that embankment, I'm a sitting duck. All he has to do is just pick me off as soon as I crest the top of the hill. So I chose not to run after him, but the dust begins to settle. You see the female suspect trying to climb up the embankment. So at that time, I switched my attention from him to her, began shouting commands to her. After a few commands, she began to listen and respond and began to walk towards me, and I told her to put her face on the ground. She laid down on the ground, and I then began to handcuff her.
The driver is identified within moments of her being taken into custody as Adrienne Simpson.
Adrienne identifies the male suspect as her boyfriend, Tyler Terry.
Luckily, none of our deputies were hurt. We had about 5 vehicles that had bullet holes in them, one being initially the shot fired into Sydney Knipe's car.
The bullet ended up in her headrest.
She ducked fast enough to miss it.
By the grace of God, she was not hit.
It was a surreal moment, seeing that and knowing that she could have been taken away from us by somebody that didn't care about us at all.
Authorities remain on high alert for an armed and dangerous suspected killer.
The stakes are higher now because we have someone who has no regard for human life, and he is now in a rural, wooded area in our county.
At this point, we feel that we're dealing with an individual that's unhinged, that's angry, and that isn't going to be afraid to harm somebody in their path.
We knew we had to do all that we could do to get him in custody.
Adrienne Simpson and her boyfriend Tyler Terry are suspects in the disappearance of Adrienne's estranged husband, Eugene Simpson, and the murder of Thomas Harden. After a high-speed car chase with Chester County Police, Adrienne is in custody, and Tyler remains at large.
The difficulties in the search was the perimeter was very large. It's a very wooded area. You also have farms in the area where an individual can hide out in barns.
It was almost like he was a ghost and couldn't be caught.
On May 18th, as local and state officials search for Tyler, Adrienne is questioned by police.
When I arrived at Chester County Detention Center, Adrienne seemed wore down, but she was willing and able to speak with me.
Our first priority was to talk about the disappearance of Eugene Simpson and her potential involvement in that. We asked her to describe what had occurred.
She disclosed that Tyler had shot and killed Eugene.
Adrienne alleges she and Tyler had arranged to meet Eugene to discuss custody of their children.
She said she wanted to talk to him. They met in a rural area.
She said that Eugene and Tyler had walked down the road and she heard gunshots. Sees Tyler returning without Eugene. Tyler gets in the car and tells her that he indeed had shot Eugene.
Adrienne says that Tyler shoots alone and that he leaves him in the ditch. Adrienne never told us that the intentions were to kill Eugene Simpson. She said that Tyler was controlling. He wanted her for himself. Tyler no longer wanted Adrienne to be associated, attached, married, or whatever to Eugene Simpson.
Adrienne's willingness to stay in the acts of what Tyler Terry and her had done was just the thinking that she really loved him, that she would do anything just to keep him happy.
Adrienne claims that earlier the same night, Tyler had forced her to accompany him to Thomas Harden's house.
She did admit to driving Tyler to the house of Thomas.
Tyler tells her they're going to go get some marijuana. But when he gets out of the car, he is armed with a handgun.
She'd heard about 4 gunshots. Tyler came running back and put the gun on the floorboard and told her to drive. So she did put herself on scene, but did not disclose to me of any prior knowledge to what Tyler was planning to do to Thomas.
She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem... It was like she was literally telling us a story.
Then, Adrienne drops a bombshell.
Once we talk about everything that's happened in Chester and York, she talks about some other shootings, much to the surprise of our investigators at the time.
Adrienne Simpson and Tyler Terry are possibly involved in murders that have occurred in Missouri.
Adrienne explains that after Eugene and Thomas's murders, she and Tyler hit the road for St. Louis. When they arrived, they stopped at an upscale hotel.
They see a gentleman standing there with some bags.
Tyler has the 9mm and he shoots the person standing there, who ends up being killed at that moment. They searched through his belongings and really didn't find anything else of value at that time.
After fleeing the scene, Adrienne admits that Tyler began looking for the next target.
There's a BMW that's traveling down the road in the same direction. She described this as an opportunity because this is a fancy vehicle. These folks most likely had money.
Tyler shoots out of the vehicle, strikes the BMW in the driver's side back window. The BMW appears to make a sudden movement to get away.
It was like the longer she sat there, the more things just came out. It was just like a wow moment.
That's the first thought I had, that we're kind of dealing with a potential modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. When she's describing the violence, she is portraying Tyler Terry as being the violent person during these incidents.
Adrienne never said that she was in fear for her life or that she was afraid of him. She never voiced that.
investigators contact authorities in St. Louis and learn that the man at the hotel was Dr. Sergei Zakharev, a beloved local anesthesiologist.
I could not believe that this has happened. This tragic event devastated his family and his friends. Sergei had this amazing personality that made him a friend to so many.
Investigators also identify the couple in the BMW.
The vehicle being driven by Stanley Goodkin, and his wife Barbara was inside, and she was fatally wounded by the gunfire from Tyler Terry.
On May 18th, investigators set out to recover Eugene Simpson's body.
Stroud Road, it's a very rural area. There's woods on both sides, some fields on both sides. It's kind of where it was, where Eugene's body had been dumped and where she told us to go look.
And eventually Chester County deputies were able to locate the body of Eugene Simpson.
We got a phone call saying that there has been a body found on Stroud Road. And once we heard that, we took off over there, and that's when we broke down. It was very tragic.
When authorities receive the autopsy results, they make an alarming discovery.
There were some bullet fragments that were found in relation to the body. And we learned that there were multiple weapons involved.
One was a .38 and one was a 9. But Adrienne says that Tyler shoots alone.
With evidence pointing towards a second shooter, investigators feel certain that Adrienne played a larger role in the crime than she had let on.
At this point, my focus was on assisting any way possible to safely and peacefully apprehend Tyler Terry, for us to talk to him and see what he has to say about all of this.
48 hours into the manhunt for Tyler Terry, investigators call on federal agencies for help.
We decided to set up the command center at the Louisville High School football stadium. The FBI deployed drones. We had multiple bloodhound tracking units. At one time, we had as many as 5 helicopters involved.
We had over 300 law enforcement officers.
The FBI, ATF, and SLED are assisting in the search. Authorities say Terry is armed and should be considered extremely dangerous.
Homeowners were fearful that he could kick the door in, so we had residents who were arming themselves and patrolling their own neighborhoods.
The entire community is on pins and needles. Everyone was on alert because this serial killer is on the loose.
They need to go ahead and get him off the streets with all the harms that he's done to the families.
On May 24th, 7 days into the search, law enforcement catches a break.
One of our deputies actually saw him run across Highway 9. It just made the stakes even higher. We had to capture this guy.
After a terrifying 7-day manhunt, authorities have spotted suspected killer Tyler Terry crossing a highway in Chester County, South Carolina.
I briefed the teams that were going into the woods, and I reminded them of a Bible verse. We're told not to be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good. The longer he stayed out there, the more dangerous the situation became. We had to capture him, and so they did. They said, subjects in custody.
Breaking news at noon, Tyler Terry in custody.
On the radio at the command center, everybody was hugging and high-fiving.
For us to be able to peacefully apprehend him without a single shot being fired was nothing short of a miracle.
I believe he was ready to be caught. He'd been living in the woods for days, terrible conditions, very little to eat and drink.
On May 24th, investigators interviewed Tyler, hoping to learn more about Adrienne's involvement.
Our first interview with him took place at the hospital where he was receiving fluids.
We start talking about Thomas Harden. He tells us that he and Adrienne go to Thomas Harden's home. And when Thomas opens the door, he shoots him. The difference between the two stories is that Tyler actually says Adrienne is with him at the door. Tyler told us that he shot Thomas because Thomas was ruining his life by telling people that they were in a relationship.
Tyler said Thomas used to parade him around as if they were a couple. Tyler denied any romantic involvement with Thomas.
Tyler also opens up to investigators about his feelings for Adrienne.
He actually gets very emotional. He cries at one point. He tells us how much he loves Adrienne.
There was one thing that Tyler kept alluding to, and that was Adrienne was his battery, and that he kind of fed off of her.
He actually smiles and he says, what would Harley Quinn be without the Joker? He says that basically she's the reason that he does what he does.
When investigators ask Tyler about Eugene Simpson's murder, his version mirrors Adrienne's, except for one major difference.
He tells us that ultimately, yeah, he shot Eugene Simpson, but Adrienne also shot Eugene.
According to Tyler, Eugene and Adrienne get out of the vehicle and walk away. He looks away for just a second and hears a gunshot. And when he looks back up, he sees that Adrienne is holding the .38 revolver and that Eugene is stumbling around from an apparent gunshot wound to the head.
Eugene falls into a ditch, and at this point, Tyler says that Eugene is still alive.
He goes to the vehicle and loads the 9mm and walks over to the ditch, and he fires 2 rounds into the upper torso of Eugene.
According to Tyler, Adrienne set all this into motion because Eugene was abusive throughout their marriage. We were never able to show any documentation for Eugene assaulting Adrienne.
Tyler admits to the murders of Sergei Zakharev and Barbara Goodkin in St. Louis. But then he reveals a 5th murder in Memphis, Tennessee.
This was a case that was not on our radar. We had no idea that they had committed a murder in Memphis.
Adrienne didn't talk about the incident in Memphis at all. Tyler stated that it was her doing, not his doing. According to Tyler, she's pretending they have a flat tire, and when the gentleman pulls up next to them, Adrienne shoots out the driver's side window, striking the gentleman, and he falls flat on his back into the roadway.
Tyler said he's laid there with his arms stretched out like Jesus on the cross. He said if she went through his property, there was only like $40 that they took off of this person.
So at this point, we contact Memphis. We verify this did indeed happen.
The victim was determined to be Dentario Coates.
But at this point, we have no reason not to believe Tyler because he filled in all the gaps and told us things that she completely left out.
He just started talking and talked until everything was confessed to. It's almost as like they wanted to be known as this Bonnie and Clyde type couple.
Authorities charged Tyler and Adrienne with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, along with other crimes.
Mr. Terry was facing about 26 charges if you add both of his York allegations as well as his Chester allegations.
On November 2nd, 2022, more than a year after their deadly 3-state rampage, Adrienne and Tyler plead guilty and are sentenced to life without parole.
They confessed to the murders and several of the other crimes. By doing this, they managed to avoid the death penalty.
What a guilty plea offers a family in a situation like this is finality. And also, you offer them and spare them the graphic details that come from a trial. Knowing that both of them will die in prison, I think was a comfort to the family.
I do think they got, what they deserved.
Tyler and Adrienne fueled each other's passion, and in their minds were able to justify what they did because they teamed up together.
They laid a trail of tears and a trail of just hurt, throughout South Carolina, all the way to Missouri and Memphis.
Thomas was a good person, a real good person. And I hate that he's gone. I mean, at an early age. To this day, I still can't believe it happened.
Gino wasn't perfect and he had flaws, but...
The phone rang just before dawn, a shrill sound cutting through a quiet California neighborhood that had learned to sleep lightly. Because in this place, silence had never meant safety. On the other end of the line was a voice tight with urgency. The kind that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answer will be bad. The kind that carries the weight of a moment that will divide time into before and after. By the time the sun climbed over the low hills in the east, flashing pale gold across cracked sidewalks and modest homes, a single address had become the center of gravity for an entire community, and a story had begun that would refuse to end for decades. This was California in 1994, and what unfolded here would one day be labeled a cold case. But on that morning, it was anything but cold. It was raw, immediate, and terrifyingly alive. Police cars crowded the narrow street, red and blue lights washing over faces pressed against windows and doors left half open in shock. Neighbors whispered names they recognized, speculated in fragments, tried to make sense of the impossible. Inside the house, the air felt heavy, as if it had absorbed something violent and refused to let it go. Officers moved carefully, their footsteps measured, their eyes trained on details that might vanish if ignored for even a second. This was a scene that demanded attention, that begged to be read like a message left behind in a language no one fully understood. A young woman lay at the center of it all, her life abruptly and brutally interrupted. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no obvious struggle that could be neatly summarized in a report. Just questions hanging thick and unanswered. She had been known here. Not famous, not notorious, just familiar. The kind of person whose face you recognized at the grocery store, whose car you noticed parked in the same spot every night. Friend described her as careful, routine-driven, someone who locked her doors, someone who didn't invite danger inside. That detail would echo through the investigation like a warning bell that no one could silence. If she was careful, then how did this happen? If she was cautious, then who crossed that threshold with her? Investigators circled the room, documenting everything, photographing angles, collecting fibers, lifting prints that would later be scrutinized under unforgiving lights. Each item was bagged, labeled, preserved with the hope that science, diligence, or sheer persistence would eventually force the truth into the open. Outside, reporters arrived quickly, their cameras hungry, their notebooks already filling with phrases that would soon dominate headlines. Brutal killing, quiet neighborhood, no suspects, shocked community. The language of crime reporting has a rhythm of its own, and this story slid into it with frightening ease. By midday, the name of the victim was everywhere, spoken by strangers who felt an unsettling intimacy with her final moments. Tips poured in almost immediately. A strange car scene late at night. A man arguing on the sidewalk weeks earlier. A scream that might have been heard or might have been imagined. Detectives listened to everything, aware that somewhere in the noise there might be a signal strong enough to lead them forward. They reconstructed her final hours with obsessive care. Phone records were examined. Receipts were traced. Conversations were replayed through the memories of friends and co-workers who suddenly found themselves questioning every word they had exchanged with her. Had she mentioned anyone new? Had she seemed afraid? Had there been a change in her routine, that no one noticed until it was too late. Each answer spawned more questions, and each question stretched the investigation further into a maze that refused to offer a clear exit. The lack of forced entry suggested trust, or deception, or something far more calculated. Someone had been close enough to her to get inside without raising alarms, and that realization sent a chill through the neighborhood that no amount of sunshine could dispel. Days turned into weeks, and the initial surge of attention began to fade, as it always does. Other stories pushed their way into the news cycle. Other tragedies claimed the spotlight. But for the detectives assigned to the case, there was no moving on. The evidence room held boxes marked with her name, and every time they were opened, it felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. Forensic tests were conducted with the best tools available at the time, but the early 90s were a different era, one where the promise of DNA analysis was still limited, still evolving, still unable to answer the most desperate questions. Samples were taken, profiles were attempted, but nothing came back with the clarity investigators needed. No match, no immediate breakthrough, just the growing, sinking realization that this case might not yield its secrets easily. The community lived with that uncertainty like a low-grade fever. Parents walked their children to school. Doors were double-checked at night. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, but they did so under a shadow that made everything feel slightly off, slightly unsafe. Candlelight vigils were held. Flowers piled up at the edge of the crime scene long after the tape was removed. People wanted closure, justice, a sense that what had happened could be contained and corrected. Instead, they got silence. Every press conference ended with the same refrain. The investigation was ongoing. Leads were being followed. Anyone with information should come forward. It was a script that comforted no one. As months passed, theories hardened into camps. Some believed the killer was someone from her past, a relationship gone wrong, a secret that had finally exploded. Others suspected a stranger, a predator who had slipped in unnoticed and vanished just as quietly. Detectives chased both possibilities, interviewing ex-partners, co-workers, acquaintances whose only crime might have been proximity. Alibis were checked, rechecked, poked until they frayed. Yet nothing stuck. Each promising lead dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind frustration and a creeping sense of failure. The case files grew thicker, heavier, more unwieldy, until they felt less like a roadmap to the truth and more like a monument to everything that hadn't worked. By the end of the first year, the word cold began to surface in quiet conversations, though no one wanted to say it out loud. Cold case was a term loaded with defeat, with the implication that time had won, that the trail had gone irreversibly stale. The detectives resisted it, returning to the evidence again and again, hoping to see something they had missed. They laid photographs out across tables, tracing lines between people, places, moments. They asked themselves the same questions until they echoed in their sleep. What did we overlook? Who do we trust too easily? Where did the story break down? Meanwhile, the victim's family lived in a different kind of time, one measured not by calendars but by anniversaries. Birthdays that went uncelebrated. Holidays marked by an empty chair. For them, the case was never cold. It burned constantly, fueled by grief and the relentless need for answers. They watched every news update, called detectives for progress reports, clung to rumors of new leads with a hope that was as painful as it was necessary. Each passing year without resolution felt like a second loss, a confirmation that justice could be delayed indefinitely, perhaps forever. In the broader landscape of California crime in the mid-90s, this case became one among many, a file on a shelf that few outside the department remembered clearly. But inside those walls, it lingered, refusing to be forgotten. Young officers learned about it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that not every crime bends to willpower or skill. It was cited in training sessions, referenced in late-night conversations between detectives who understood the unique cruelty of unanswered questions. And always, somewhere in the back of their minds, was the belief that science might one day catch up to what intuition could not. Because even then, in 1994, there were whispers about the future of forensic evidence, about DNA techniques that were improving year by year, about databases that might one day connect dots across time and geography. The evidence from this case was preserved with that distant hope in mind, sealed away not as relics of failure, but as potential keys waiting for the right lock. No one could say when that lock would appear, or if it ever would. All they knew was that the story was unfinished, that the final chapter had not yet been written. As the years stretched on, the house where it happened changed hands. New families moved in, unaware at first of the history soaked into the walls. The street returned to its routines, its rhythms, its illusion of normalcy. But beneath that surface, the memory persisted, passed down in warnings and half-remembered conversations. Don't forget what happened here. Don't assume it can't happen again. The case faded from headlines, but it never truly disappeared. It waited, dormant but alive, like an ember buried under ash, ready to flare back into view when the right conditions aligned. And somewhere, unknown and unseen, the truth remained intact, patient and devastating, poised to shock everyone who thought the story was already over. Time did not move forward so much as it piled up, layer after layer, pressing down on the case until it felt buried beneath its own history. By the late 90s, the investigation had become a ghost that haunted the department, its name spoken softly, usually late at night, usually by detectives who had learned the hard way that some crimes refuse to yield to persistence alone. The evidence still existed, sealed in plastic and cardboard, stacked in climate-controlled rooms that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Every label was intact, every chain of custody unbroken. Yet nothing inside those boxes spoke loudly enough to point to a killer. The silence was maddening, and it grew heavier with each passing year. New detectives rotated in, bringing fresh eyes and cautious optimism. They read through transcripts, listened to taped interviews, traced timelines already traced a dozen times before. On paper, everything seemed thorough. Too thorough, perhaps. The problem wasn't neglect. It was saturation. Every obvious angle had been worked, every known associate questioned, every rumor chased to the point of collapse. The case resisted simplification. It refused to be reduced to a single mistake or a single suspect. Instead, it sprawled, a tangled mass of half-answers and unresolved possibilities. Each new investigator felt the same initial spark of confidence, followed by the same slow realization that they were walking into a maze designed to exhaust them. The community, meanwhile, learned to live with the unknown in quieter ways. The shock of the murder faded into a dull, persistent unease. People still remembered her, still mentioned her name when the topic of safety came up, but the conversations grew shorter, less detailed. Memory softened the edges, turning a brutal crime into a cautionary anecdote. For the family, that softening felt like betrayal. They marked time not by progress, but by absence, by the phone calls that never came, by the updates that always ended the same way. No new leads, no arrests, no closure. The phrase cold case had now entered the official vocabulary, stamped onto files and spoken openly in briefings, a clinical term that did nothing to capture the emotional weight it carried. Every few years, the case resurfaced in the media, usually sparked by an anniversary or a renewed plea from the family. Old photographs were reprinted. Sound bites from long-retired detectives were replayed. The same questions were asked, and the same non-answers were given. Viewers shook their heads, felt a momentary surge of sympathy, and then moved on. But those brief returns to the spotlight had an unintended effect. They kept the case alive, just enough to prevent it from being forgotten entirely. Somewhere out there, investigators believed someone might still be watching, still remembering something they hadn't realized was important at the time. Inside the department, technology crept forward in small, almost unnoticeable increments. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. Techniques that had once been considered experimental became routine. Younger detectives, trained in this new landscape, looked at old cases with a mixture of respect and frustration. Respect for the groundwork laid by their predecessors. frustration at the limitations those predecessors had been forced to accept. The evidence from 1994 was revisited periodically, not because anyone expected a miracle, but because it felt irresponsible not to try. Each review ended the same way. Insufficient data. No match. The door remained firmly closed. Yet the passage of time changed more than just technology. It changed people. Witnesses aged. Memories faded or shifted. Some individuals who had been peripheral to the case moved away, changed names, rebuilt lives. Others died, taking whatever fragments of truth they carried with them. The suspect pool, once broad and unruly, narrowed not through certainty but through attrition. Names were crossed out not because they had been cleared definitively, but because they were no longer reachable. The investigation adapted, focusing less on what could be done immediately and more on what might be possible someday. That someday became a quiet obsession for a small group of investigators who refused to let the case slip entirely into archival obscurity. They understood the odds. They knew that most cold cases never reach resolution. But they also knew that breakthroughs rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrived suddenly, triggered by an unrelated arrest, a new database entry, a chance comparison that no one could have predicted. To be ready for that moment, the groundwork had to remain intact. Evidence had to be preserved. Documentation had to be meticulous. The story had to remain coherent enough to be understood by someone encountering it for the first time, years, or even decades later. The victim's family clung to that possibility with a resilience that astonished everyone who encountered them. They attended meetings, asked questions, pushed gently but persistently for updates. They learned the language of investigations, the meaning of terms like profile and comparison and backlog. They understood delays in a way no one should have to. And still they hoped. Hope became less about expecting a resolution and more about refusing to accept permanent silence. Each year that passed without answers was both a wound and a testament to their endurance. By the early 2000s, the case had become a study in contrasts. On one hand, it was old, its origins rooted in a pre-digital era that now felt distant. On the other, it was perfectly positioned to benefit from modern advances, its evidence intact, its narrative well documented. It sat at the intersection of past and future, waiting for something to tip the balance. Investigators discussed it in strategy sessions, often hypothetically. If we ran the samples again today, would we get more information? If a new suspect entered the system, would the database catch it? These questions lingered, unanswered, but increasingly plausible. The neighborhood where it all began had changed too. New businesses opened and closed. Children who had once been walked to school by anxious parents now drove themselves to work. The house itself stood as an unassuming structure, its history invisible to passersby. But for those who knew, it remained a landmark of unresolved violence. It was referenced in directions, in stories told to newcomers, in the kind of warnings that never quite fade. This is where it happened. This is where it started. This is where it never ended. As the years stretched into decades, the case took on a mythic quality within law enforcement circles. It was cited as an example of patience, of frustration, of the limits of human effort. Some detectives avoided it, unwilling to confront a problem that had defeated so many before them. Others were drawn to it precisely because of that reputation. They saw in it a challenge, a test of whether time and technology could succeed where urgency and instinct had failed. For them, reopening the file was not an act of nostalgia, but a declaration of intent. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, conditions began to align. Databases grew denser. Algorithms improved. Cross-jurisdictional cooperation became smoother, faster, more reliable. What had once required weeks of manual comparison could now be done in hours. Evidence that had seemed inert acquired new potential. The case was no longer just a story about what had gone wrong in 1994. It was becoming a story about what might finally go right. But none of that was visible to the outside world. To the community, to the family, to anyone scanning headlines, the case remained unsolved, unresolved, painfully static. It was still a cold case, still a source of unanswered questions and lingering fear. The passage of time had dulled the initial shock, but sharpened the sense of injustice. Somewhere, everyone believed, the truth was still out there, unchanged by years and indifference. It waited in the margins, in forgotten connections, in data that had not yet found its counterpart. And so the story continued, not with a bang, but with a quiet persistence that defied erasure. The investigation did not move forward in a straight line. It hovered, circling the past, inching toward a future that no one could fully imagine yet. The silence that followed the crime was not empty. It was charged, loaded with potential energy, held in check by nothing more than time and chance. All it would take was one alignment, one unexpected connection, to shatter that silence and send shockwaves through a case everyone thought they understood. The break did not arrive with sirens or sudden confessions, but with a quiet notification buried inside a system designed to notice what humans often miss. It happened on an ordinary weekday, the kind that passes without ceremony, inside a building where fluorescent lights hummed and keyboards clicked in steady, indifferent rhythms. A forensic technician, scrolling through routine updates, paused when a flag appeared next to a familiar case number, one that had been dormant for so long it felt almost theoretical. California, 1994. Cold case. The flag didn't promise answers. It didn't announce a solution. It simply suggested a possibility, small and precise, like the first crack in a wall that had stood unchallenged for decades. The evidence had been reprocessed as part of a broader initiative, a sweeping effort to revisit old cases using methods that hadn't existed when the crimes were first investigated. Advances in DNA analysis had turned what was once static material into something dynamic, something capable of speaking again. Samples that had previously produced partial or unusable profiles were now subjected to techniques refined through years of trial and error. The expectation was modest. Most cold cases, even with new technology, remained silent. But this time the silence shifted. The initial result was incomplete, a fragment rather than a full voice, but it was enough to justify a closer look. Analysts leaned in, rechecking parameters, verifying protocols, making sure the data wasn't lying to them. The fragment held. It wasn't contamination. It wasn't error. It was something real, something that had been present all along, waiting for the right moment to be understood. Word traveled carefully through the department, not as an announcement, but as a whisper. There might be something here. Detectives who had inherited the case years after it first went cold felt a cautious jolt of adrenaline. They knew better than to celebrate too early. False hope had haunted this file before. Still, they gathered, reviewing the new data, cross-referencing it with what they already knew. The fragment didn't point to a name yet. It pointed to potential, to the idea that the case was no longer frozen in time. For the first time in years, the investigation had momentum, subtle but undeniable. The next step was comparison, a process both powerful and unforgiving. The partial profile was run through state and national databases, systems that had grown exponentially since the 90s. Millions of entries, each representing a life intersecting with law enforcement in one way or another. The wait was tense. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days. Detectives checked their inboxes with the restrained urgency of people who had learned to expect disappointment. Then another notification arrived. Not a match, but a near match. A familial link. The kind that doesn't give you a suspect, but gives you a direction. Familial DNA searching was controversial, ethically complex, and legally sensitive, but had become an invaluable tool in cases like this, where traditional avenues had long been exhausted. The near match suggested that the DNA from the crime scene belonged to someone related to a person already in the system. A brother, a cousin, a child. The possibilities multiplied, but they were no longer infinite. The maze was narrowing. Investigators moved carefully, aware that every step would be scrutinized. They pulled records, built family trees, traced connections that spanned cities and decades. The process was painstaking, more genealogical than dramatic, but it carried an undercurrent of intensity that never let up. Each name on the list represented not just a potential suspect, but a potential collapse of someone's carefully constructed normalcy. Somewhere within that web, they believed, was the person who had walked into a quiet home in 1994 and left devastation behind. As the search expanded, old details took on new significance. Addresses that had once seemed irrelevant were re-examined. Jobs, relationships, movements, all reconsidered through the lens of proximity and opportunity. Detectives revisited witness statements, listening again to voices recorded decades earlier, now armed with questions they hadn't known to ask at the time. The past felt closer, sharper, as if the years between then and now were folding in on themselves. The family was informed cautiously. There was activity, they were told. New testing, new avenues, no promises. They had heard similar words before, but this time felt different, though no one could quite explain why. Perhaps it was the specificity. Perhaps it was the confidence in the technology. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, a readiness to believe that the long wait might finally mean something. They responded with guarded hope, the kind that protects itself by expecting nothing. The community, unaware of the quiet stirrings behind closed doors, continued its routines. The story had faded from public consciousness, remembered only by those directly touched by it. That invisibility worked in the investigators' favor. There was no media pressure, no rush to produce sound bites. They could move deliberately, verifying every step, building a case that would withstand scrutiny not just from a court, but from time itself. After decades of waiting, they were not about to let impatience undo what technology had made possible. As the family tree narrowed, one branch began to draw particular attention. A relative whose timeline placed them in the area in 1994. A relative whose history contained gaps, periods unaccounted for, questions unanswered. The name was not immediately recognizable, not a figure who had loomed large in the original investigation. That in itself was unsettling. The possibility that the killer had been invisible all along, hidden in plain sight, fueled both determination and unease. How many times had they brushed past the truth without realizing it? Surveillance began quietly. Records were pulled. Patterns were analyzed. The suspect's life unfolded on paper in a series of mundane details that felt almost offensive in their normalcy. Jobs held. Relationships formed and dissolved. A life lived without obvious markers of violence. And yet, beneath that surface, there was a connection to a moment of unimaginable brutality. The contrast was jarring, a reminder that monsters rarely announce themselves. The decision to move forward required consensus, legal approval, and a meticulous strategy. Detectives knew that DNA alone, especially partial or familial, was not enough. They needed corroboration. They needed context. They needed to place this person not just genetically, but physically and circumstantially at the center of the crime. Every step was documented, every inference tested. The case was no longer cold, but it was still fragile. When investigators finally made contact, it was under the guise of routine. A knock on the door, a request for cooperation. The suspect's reaction was noted carefully, cataloged alongside dozens of others over the years. There was no dramatic breakdown, no immediate confession, just a measured response, polite, controlled. The kind that can mean nothing or everything. A voluntary DNA sample was requested, justified through legal channels that had been prepared in advance. The waiting resumed, heavier now, charged with possibility. As the sample was processed, the weight of decades pressed down on everyone involved. Detectives thought about the first officers on the scene in 1994, the ones who had worked the case with tools that now felt primitive by comparison. They thought about the victim, frozen in time, her life reduced to evidence and memory. They thought about the family, who had carried this absence for so long it had reshaped them. The stake felt enormous, not just legally, but morally. This was not just about solving a case. It was about honoring the persistence that had kept it alive. When the results came back, they did not arrive with spectacle. They arrived as data, clean and unequivocal. A match. Not partial, not suggestive, definitive. The DNA from the crime scene belonged to the person whose sample now sat in the lab system. After years of ambiguity, the truth emerged with brutal clarity. The room went quiet as investigators absorbed the weight of what they were seeing. This was it, the moment they had imagined and doubted in equal measure. Yet even then, there was no celebration, just a solemn recognition that the story was about to change forever. The cold case that had lingered for decades was no longer unsolved. It was about to re-enter the world with force, bringing consequences that would ripple outward, shocking a community that thought the danger belonged to the past. The silence that had surrounded the case was finally breaking, not with a whisper, but with the unmistakable sound of truth asserting itself at last. The arrest did not happen in the dead of night or under flashing lights meant for television. It happened in broad daylight, quietly, efficiently, the way modern justice prefers when it knows the weight of what it is about to unleash. Officers approached with calm voices and controlled movements, hands resting near their belts, but never rushing, as if any sudden motion might fracture the fragile reality that had just been confirmed by science. When the words were spoken, when the suspect was told why they were there was a pause, a fraction of a second where the world seemed to hesitate. Decades collapsed into that silence. California, 1994, surged forward and claimed its due. News traveled fast once it broke containment. A cold case solved, a DNA breakthrough, an arrest after all these years. Headlines ignited across screens and front pages, their language sharp and incredulous, their tone a mixture of triumph and disbelief. For the community, the shock was visceral. Many had forgotten the details, some had forgotten the name, but the moment they saw the date, recognition snapped back into place. This was not a new crime. This was an old wound being torn open. People who had built lives on the assumption that the danger had passed were forced to confront the reality that it had never truly left. The suspect's face circulated quickly, dissected by strangers who searched for meaning in eyes and posture, who tried to reconcile the image of an ordinary person with the brutality described in reports. Neighbors gave interviews, repeating a familiar refrain. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He seemed normal. The words echoed those spoken in countless other cases, a reminder that violence rarely announces itself in advance. The ordinariness was what unsettled people most. This was not a monster from the margins. This was someone who had blended in, who had aged alongside everyone else, carrying a secret that had outlived fear and suspicion. Inside the interrogation room, the tone was controlled, almost restrained. Detectives did not need to shout. They did not need to bluff. The evidence spoke for itself, cold and precise. They laid out timelines, movements, connections, each piece fitting into a structure that had taken decades to assemble. When the DNA was mentioned, there was another pause, longer this time. The suspect's composure shifted subtly, not into panic, but into something closer to resignation. Science had closed the door that time had kept open. There was no dramatic confession, no cinematic collapse. What emerged instead were fragments, partial acknowledgments, moments of deflection wrapped in carefully chosen words. It was enough. Combined with the forensic evidence, it formed a narrative that could finally withstand scrutiny. The case, once fragile and speculative, now felt solid, anchored by proof that could not be argued away. Detectives felt the strange duality of the moment, satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that nothing they did could restore what had been taken. When the family was notified, the call carried a weight unlike any other. They had waited for this moment for so long that it felt unreal when it finally arrived. There was no immediate joy, no clean sense of victory. There were tears, yes, but they came mixed with anger, disbelief, and a profound exhaustion. Closure, they discovered, was not a single emotion, but a collision of many. The truth they had demanded for decades now stood before them, undeniable and irreversible. It answered questions, but it also raised new ones. Why her? Why then? How had this been allowed to stretch across so many years? As court proceedings began, the story shifted again, moving from investigation to adjudication. Legal language replaced investigative jargon. Evidence became exhibits. Timelines were presented not as theories, but as arguments. The defense examined every step, searching for weakness, for procedural missteps that could fracture the case. The prosecution leaned heavily on the DNA, framing it as the voice that had waited patiently to be heard. Expert witnesses explained the science in careful terms, translating complexity into certainty for a jury tasked with bridging decades of distance. The courtroom became a stage for the past, a place where 1994 was reconstructed piece by piece. Photographs resurfaced. Testimony revived moments that many had tried to forget. The victim's name was spoken repeatedly, each time reinforcing the reality that she was more than a case file, more than a catalyst for technological triumph. She was a person whose life had been cut short, whose absence had shaped everyone left behind. The proceedings were methodical, deliberate, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the crime itself. Outside, the media presence was relentless. Cameras lined the steps. Commentators speculated endlessly, debating not just guilt, but meaning. What did it say about justice that it could take this long? What did it say about safety, about trust, about the illusion of closure? Cold case, solved became a refrain, but the word solved felt insufficient, too neat for something that had sprawled across so many lives. The community watched, some with fascination, others with a quiet dread that refused to dissipate. For investigators, the trial marked a transition rather than an ending. They reviewed their own work with a critical eye, documenting lessons learned, protocols validated, mistakes acknowledged. The case became a reference point, a testament to persistence and preservation. Evidence saved rather than discarded. Files maintained rather than forgotten. It reinforced a belief that patience, combined with advancing science, could rewrite outcomes once thought permanent. Yet beneath that professional pride was a somber recognition of time lost, of justice delayed beyond any reasonable measure. The suspect's history was scrutinized in parallel. Every year since 1994 examined for signs that had gone unnoticed. There were no subsequent violent crimes attributed to him, no pattern that would have flagged him earlier. That absence disturbed people almost as much as the crime itself. It suggested a capacity for compartmentalization so complete that it defied easy explanation. The idea that someone could commit such an act and then resume a seemingly ordinary life forced uncomfortable questions about how well anyone truly knows the people around them. As the trial progressed, the narrative hardened. This was no longer a mystery. It was a reckoning. Jurors listened, weighed, deliberated. The verdict, when it came, landed with a heavy finality that rippled outward. Guilty. The word carried authority, but it did not carry relief. It marked the end of a legal process, not the end of pain. Sentencing followed, a formal acknowledgement of harm measured in years and statutes, inadequate by nature but necessary by law. In the aftermath, the community attempted to recalibrate. Memorials were revisited. Conversations reopened. People reassessed memories they had stored away, now reframed by the knowledge of who had been responsible. The house, the street, the routines that had once seemed benign were viewed through a sharper lens. The solved cold case did not restore innocence. It stripped it away permanently. For the family, life moved into an unfamiliar phase. Advocacy gave way to reflection. Anger softened into something quieter but no less intense. They spoke publicly at times, their words measured, their faces carrying the visible imprint of years spent waiting. They thanked investigators, acknowledged the role of science, but they did not pretend that justice erased loss. The absence remained, now accompanied by certainty instead of questions. And beneath all of it, there lingered an uneasy awareness that this story was exceptional precisely because it had ended differently from so many others. For every cold case solved by DNA, countless more remained suspended in silence, their evidence degraded, their witnesses gone, their truths locked away. This case became a symbol, held up as proof of what is possible, even as it highlighted the vastness of what is still unknown. The shock that began with a phone call before dawn in 1994 had finally completed its arc, detonating again decades later with equal force. The difference was clarity. The chaos had been replaced by certainty, the questions by answers that could no longer be avoided. Yet as the headlines faded and the cameras moved on, one truth remained, stark and unyielding. Solving a cold case does not warm the past. It only illuminates it, casting a harsh light on what was taken, what was missed, and what can never be returned. After the verdict, the noise fell away in stages, like an echo retreating down a long corridor. The cameras packed up first, then the commentators found new angles, new cases, new phrases to repeat. What remained was quieter and heavier, a residue that settled into the lives of everyone touched by the case. Justice had spoken in a courtroom, but outside those walls, the consequences continued to unfold, uneven and unresolved. The solved cold case did not close a chapter so much as it rewrote the margins of every chapter that came before it. For investigators, the days after sentencing were filled with paperwork and reflection, an administrative exhale after years of tension. Reports were finalized. Evidence logs were updated one last time. Boxes that had once been marked pending were relabeled closed. The physical act of filing away the case felt almost ceremonial, a gesture that acknowledged an ending even as it resisted finality. Some detectives visited the evidence room alone, standing briefly in front of shelves they had memorized by heart, letting the reality settle in. This case, the one that had haunted briefings and late-night conversations, was no longer an open wound. It was a scar. The role of DNA, once a supporting character, had become central, its influence radiating outward into policy discussions and training manuals. Departments across the state revisited their own cold cases with renewed urgency, inspired and unsettled by what had just happened. If this case could be solved after decades, what else was waiting? What other truths were sealed in plastic, dormant but intact? Funding requests were drafted. Backlogs were re-examined. The solved case became a catalyst, a proof point wielded in meetings and grant proposals, a reminder that time, when paired with preservation, could still yield results. But progress came with discomfort. The spotlight on forensic success forced a reckoning with past limitations and missed opportunities. Why had certain samples not been tested sooner? Why had some investigative paths been abandoned too quickly? These questions were not accusations so much as acknowledgments of reality, of a system constrained by the knowledge and resources of its time. Still, they lingered, complicating the narrative of triumph. Every solved cold case casts a shadow made of unsolved ones, and this was no exception. The community processed the outcome in fragmented ways. For some, the arrest and conviction felt like vindication, a long-delayed affirmation that the fear they had carried was justified. For others, it reopened anxieties they had learned to suppress. The realization that the perpetrator had lived among them for years, unnoticed and unchallenged, destabilized assumptions about safety and familiarity. Conversations at coffee shops and bus stops drifted toward uneasy territory. How well do we really know anyone? How much trust is too much? The answers were elusive, and that uncertainty became part of the case's legacy. The house where it happened remained unchanged in structure, but transformed in meaning. Its walls had absorbed decades of speculation, rumor, and now, confirmation. New occupants learned the story not from official plaques or markers, but from neighbors who spoke in lowered voices, from internet searches that refused to forget. The address became shorthand for a cautionary tale, a reminder that history can cling to a place long after the tape is removed. It was no longer just a house. It was a reference point. For the victim's family, life after the verdict unfolded in a way no one could have prepared them for. The pursuit that had defined so many years suddenly ended, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Advocacy had given their grief direction. Waiting had given it structure. Now, with answers in hand, they faced a quieter challenge, learning how to live without the momentum of the fight. They spoke often of relief, but it was a relief edged with sorrow, an acknowledgement that clarity did not restore what had been lost. It simply changed the shape of the pain. They revisited memories with new context, moments once clouded by uncertainty, now illuminated by truth. Some recollections felt heavier. Others, unexpectedly, felt lighter. Knowing who was responsible removed the corrosive doubt that had attached itself to every interaction, every memory of that time. Yet the knowledge also sharpened grief, fixing it to a specific person, a specific choice, a specific moment that could never be undone. Closure, they learned, was not an ending. It was a transition. The convicted man receded into the system, his name replaced by an inmate number, his story distilled into legal summaries and criminological footnotes. Public interest in him waned quickly, as it often does once the spectacle fades. But his existence remained a quiet provocation, a reminder of how seamlessly violence can coexist with normalcy. Analysts and psychologists debated his profile, searching for patterns that might explain how someone could commit such an act and then blend back into society. No single explanation satisfied. The case resisted simplification, even in resolution. As months passed, the solved cold case entered a new phase of existence, one defined less by investigation and more by interpretation. Documentaries were proposed. Podcasts dissected timelines with forensic enthusiasm. Articles revisited the breakthrough, framing it as evidence of a new era in law enforcement. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the patience of detectives, the power of DNA, the perseverance of a family. The story became modular, adaptable to different audiences, its core reshaped by perspective. Yet beneath these retellings, the original shock remained intact. The idea that a crime could lie dormant for so long and then erupt back into relevance unsettled people on a fundamental level. It challenged the notion that the past stays buried, that time alone can neutralize harm. This case demonstrated the opposite. Time preserved the evidence. Time sharpened the impact. Time waited indifferent until technology caught up. Inside law enforcement circles, the case influenced training in subtle but lasting ways. New recruits learned not just the mechanics of evidence collection, but the philosophy behind it. Preserve everything. Document relentlessly. Assume that future tools will see what current ones cannot. The solved cold case became a parable, its lessons woven into curricula and culture. It reminded investigators that their work might outlast them, that decisions made in the first hours of a crime could echo decades later. The broader public absorbed a simpler message, one repeated in headlines and conversations alike. Science can change everything. DNA doesn't forget. Cold cases are never truly dead. These phrases carried hope, but also an implicit warning. For perpetrators, it suggested that time was no longer a shield. For victims' families, it offered a fragile promise that waiting might not be in vain. For everyone else, it introduced a new relationship with the past, one where old secrets felt less secure. And still, unanswered questions lingered at the edges. Why this crime, committed once and never repeated? What internal calculus allowed the perpetrator to move on? How many other cases sat in evidence rooms, technically solvable but practically stalled by resources and prioritization? The solved case illuminated these gaps without filling them. It proved possibility, not inevitability. Years after the conviction, the case continued to surface in unexpected ways. A mention in a training seminar, a citation in a research paper, a reference in a debate about privacy and familial DNA searching. Each appearance stripped away a little more of its singularity, integrating it into a broader conversation about justice, technology, and time. Yet for those who had lived it directly, it remained intensely personal, resistant to abstraction. On quiet nights, detectives who had worked the case sometimes thought back to its earliest moments, to the initial phone call, the first walk through the scene, the feeling that something irreversible had occurred. They measured that memory against the moment the DNA match came through, the point where possibility crystallized into certainty. Between those 2 points stretched decades of effort, doubt, and endurance. The distance was staggering, and it carried a weight that no verdict could fully lift. The story of the California 1994 cold case did not conclude with applause or relief. It settled instead into a complicated equilibrium, part resolution, part reminder. It showed what persistence could achieve and what it could not. It delivered answers, but it also exposed the cost of waiting for them. In the end, the case stood as both an achievement and a caution, a testament to how far justice can reach and how long its shadow can stretch. Even solved, it refused to be silent. Time kept moving. Indifferent to the gravity the case still carried, but its motion felt different now, less oppressive and more contemplative, as if the years that followed the conviction were no longer waiting for answers, but trying to understand what those answers meant. The solved cold case entered a long afterlife, one not measured by headlines or court dates, but by the quieter ways it reshaped thinking, policy, and memory. It lingered in the background of conversations about justice, surfacing whenever someone asked whether the past could truly be left behind. Within law enforcement, the case became a reference point invoked with a mix of pride and humility. Pride, because perseverance and preservation had ultimately paid off. Humility, because it underscored how easily truth can slip through gaps created by time, technology, and human limitation. Senior detectives spoke about it to younger officers not as a victory lap, but as a lesson in restraint. Don't assume you've reached the end, they would say. Don't assume today's answers are final. The evidence you collect now might speak louder long after you're gone. Training rooms echoed with discussions sparked by the case. Scenarios were built around it. Decisions made in 1994 were dissected with modern eyes, not to assign blame, but to understand how context shapes outcomes. The lack of forced entry, the early assumptions about motive, the initial DNA test that yielded nothing definitive. Each element was examined as part of a chain, where no single link was weak enough to explain the delay, but together they revealed how easily momentum can dissipate. The case reminded everyone that investigations are not just about solving crimes quickly, but about building foundations strong enough to endure. Outside institutional walls, the public absorbed the story more slowly, filtering it through personal fears and expectations. For some, it reinforced faith in the system, proof that justice, though delayed, could still arrive. For others, it highlighted a harsher reality, that justice often depends on luck, on technological leaps that may or may not come in time. The solved cold case became a mirror, reflecting whatever belief the viewer already held. Hope and skepticism coexisted uneasily, both fed by the same facts. The victim's name continued to appear in articles and documentaries, but over time, the tone shifted. Early coverage had focused on shock and surprise. Later pieces leaned into reflection, exploring the emotional toll of waiting decades for answers. Interviews with family members grew quieter, more introspective. They spoke less about anger and more about endurance, about how grief evolves when it is stretched across years without resolution. Their voices carried an authority born not of expertise, but of survival. They described the strange moment when certainty finally arrived, how it didn't feel like an ending, but like a door opening into unfamiliar territory. For so long, their lives had been oriented around the absence of truth. When that absence disappeared, it left a void of its own. They had to relearn how to remember without questioning, how to mourn without searching for new explanations. The solved cold case did not erase their loss. It reframed it, anchoring it to reality instead of speculation. The broader community grappled with a similar recalibration. People revisited memories of the 90s, reassessing the sense of safety they had once taken for granted. Some recalled small moments that now felt ominous in hindsight. A stranger's glance, a passing interaction. Others resisted that impulse, wary of rewriting the past through the lens of knowledge it never had. The tension between hindsight and fairness became part of the case's cultural footprint, a reminder of how easily narratives shift once outcomes are known. Academic circles took notice as well. Criminologists and legal scholars cited the case in discussions about cold case methodology, DNA ethics, and the psychological impact of delayed justice. Papers were written, conferences held, debates sharpened. Familial DNA searching, in particular, became a focal point. Advocates pointed to the case as evidence of its power to solve crimes long thought unsolvable. Critics raised concerns about privacy, consent, and the potential for misuse. The case stood at the center of that debate, a real-world example that resisted easy categorization. The technology itself continued to evolve, building on the success it had demonstrated here. Databases grew more interconnected. Algorithms became more precise. What had once required human intuition supplemented by limited data now leaned increasingly on computation, pattern recognition, and scale. Yet the case remained a reminder that technology alone is not enough. Without careful preservation, without the foresight to save evidence properly, even the most advanced tools would have nothing to work with. Progress, it seemed, was as much about patience as it was about innovation. For the detectives who had worked the case in its later years, the resolution brought a complicated sense of closure. They felt pride in having seen it through, but also a lingering awareness of those who had not lived to see the ending. Retired officers, some now gone, had invested years of effort with no guarantee of success. Their contributions, though invisible in the final headlines, were woven into the outcome. The solved cold case was not the triumph of a single moment, but the accumulation of countless decisions made by people who believed the truth mattered, even when it seemed unreachable. Quietly, the case influenced how evidence rooms were organized, how long materials were retained, how aggressively old cases were revisited. Policies shifted incrementally, often without public attention, guided by the understanding that tomorrow's tools might unlock today's mysteries. The solved cold case became part of institutional memory, shaping choices in ways that were subtle but enduring. It changed how time itself was perceived within investigations, no longer just an enemy, but a variable that could work in favor of those willing to wait. The convicted man's story faded almost entirely from view, mentioned only in legal contexts or analytical discussions. His name lost its power to shock, replaced by the broader implications of what his identification represented. He became less a person than a data point, an example cited in arguments about detection and deterrence. The focus shifted away from him and toward the system that had finally revealed him. In that shift, the case took on a more abstract significance, one that extended beyond individual guilt. Yet abstraction never fully captured the human cost. Anniversaries still arrived, carrying a weight that no verdict could neutralize. Flowers still appeared, sometimes anonymously, at places associated with the victim. These gestures were quieter now, less public, but no less meaningful. They spoke to a need to remember not just the crime, but the life that preceded it, the ordinary moments that had been eclipsed by violence. The solved cold case, for all its procedural importance, was ultimately about that interruption. As years passed, new cases emerged, each with its own urgency, its own potential to become tomorrow's unresolved mystery. Investigators found themselves referencing the California 1994 case when deciding how much effort to invest in evidence that seemed unpromising. It became a counterweight to cynicism, a reminder that today's dead ends might be temporary. This mindset did not solve every case, but it changed the way failure was interpreted. A lack of immediate answers no longer meant futility. It meant waiting. The public narrative slowly stabilized, settling into a story told less often but with greater depth. When it was mentioned, it carried a sense of gravity rather than surprise. Listeners nodded, recognizing it as one of those cases that had altered expectations. It became part of the collective understanding of what cold case meant, not just a label for unsolved crimes, but a category defined by endurance, by the possibility of resurrection long after hope had dimmed. In that sense, the case never truly ended. It continued to exert influence, to shape attitudes and decisions in ways that extended far beyond its original context. It reminded people that the past is not static, that it can be revisited, reinterpreted, and sometimes resolved. But it also reminded them that resolution comes with its own complexities, its own emotional aftershocks. The solved cold case was not a clean line drawn under history. It was a hinge connecting what was to what might be, forcing everyone involved to reconsider their relationship with time, truth, and justice. Even as new generations grew up unaware of the fear that once gripped a California neighborhood in 1994, the case remained present, embedded in systems and stories that outlasted individual memory. It stood as evidence that silence is not the same as absence, that unanswered questions can persist without fading, and that sometimes the past waits patiently for the future to catch up. And in that waiting, the case continued to speak, not loudly, not urgently, but with a steady insistence that truth, once uncovered, never stops resonating. Years after the case was officially closed, its presence still surfaced in unexpected moments, like a shadow that moved even when the light seemed fixed. It appeared in quiet conversations between detectives who had never worked the investigation but felt its influence in the way they approached their own cases. It emerged in classrooms where criminal justice students studied the anatomy of failure and perseverance side by side. It lingered in the collective memory as a reminder that certainty, once believed unreachable, could arrive long after patience had worn thin. The idea of a cold case itself began to change shape because of it. Once, the term implied stagnation, a kind of institutional surrender masked by procedure. Now it carried a different resonance, one tempered by the knowledge that dormancy was not the same as defeat. The California 1994 cold case became shorthand for that transformation. It was no longer cited only as a tragedy, but as a turning point, a demonstration of how time, when paired with intent and preservation, could reverse assumptions once thought permanent. For those who lived near the original scene, the resolution triggered a slow, almost reluctant re-examination of memory. People revisited where they had been when the news first broke decades earlier. Some remembered standing on sidewalks watching police tape flutter in a breeze, sensing that something irrevocable had happened without fully understanding what it meant. Others recalled the weeks that followed, the rumors that circulated, the unease that settled into daily routines. These recollections, once hazy, sharpened under the weight of new knowledge. The past felt closer, less abstract, as if the years between then and now had compressed. There was a subtle shift in how people spoke about safety. The confidence that had crept back into the neighborhood over time was now tempered by realism. Not paranoia, but awareness. The solved cold case did not inspire panic, but it did dismantle the comforting belief that danger announces itself clearly and leaves when ignored. It reminded people that threats can remain hidden, that familiarity is not proof of harmlessness. This understanding settled quietly, influencing choices in ways that were rarely articulated but deeply felt. Within families who had followed the case from a distance, conversations took on a generational tone. Parents who had once warned their children about locking doors now found themselves explaining to grandchildren why a decades-old case still mattered. The story became a teaching tool, not about fear, but about vigilance and empathy. It illustrated how one act of violence could ripple outward across time, touching people who had never known the victim personally but felt connected through shared space and history. The victim's family continued to navigate their own evolving relationship with the truth. In the years immediately following the conviction, they found themselves fielding questions from journalists, researchers, and advocates. Over time, those requests diminished, replaced by a quieter respect for their privacy. They spoke less frequently, choosing their moments carefully. When they did speak, their words carried a depth that resisted simplification. They talked about the difference between knowing and healing, about how certainty can coexist with sorrow without canceling it out. They described how anniversaries changed after the case was solved. Dates once marked by frustration and unanswered questions now carried a different weight, still painful but less chaotic. Grief became steadier, less reactive. The constant mental replay of possibilities gave way to a single, unchangeable truth. It did not make the loss easier, but it made it clearer. In that clarity, they found a measure of stability that had been absent for decades. The justice system, too, continued to absorb lessons from the case, though often in understated ways. Policies shifted incrementally rather than dramatically. Evidence retention standards were revisited. Interagency communication improved. Cold case units received more attention, not as repositories for forgotten files, but as active spaces of possibility. The solved case served as quiet justification for these changes, cited less often by name and more often by implication. It had altered expectations, raising the baseline for what was considered worth revisiting. Technological optimism grew alongside caution. The success of DNA analysis in this case fueled enthusiasm for its application elsewhere, but it also sharpened awareness of its limits. Not every case would have preserved samples. Not every sample would yield usable data. Not every match would lead to a clean narrative of guilt and resolution. The California 1994 case became a benchmark, not a guarantee, a reminder that breakthroughs are contingent on preparation as much as innovation. In academic discussions, the case continued to generate debate about ethics and responsibility. Familial DNA searching remained a particularly charged topic. Proponents pointed to the undeniable outcome, the way it had finally named a perpetrator after decades of silence. Critics questioned the broader implications, the potential for intrusion into the lives of people who had committed no crime. The case resisted being used as a simple argument for either side. It existed as evidence of both power and complexity, forcing discussions to move beyond slogans and into nuance. The cultural impact of the case extended into storytelling, shaping how crime narratives were framed. Writers and filmmakers became more attuned to the long arc of unresolved violence, less focused on instant solutions and more interested in endurance. The solved cold case influenced tone as much as content, encouraging depictions that acknowledged waiting, frustration, and the slow accumulation of effort. It reminded audiences that real justice rarely arrives with dramatic timing. More often, it arrives quietly, reshaping lives without fanfare. For detectives still in the field, the case became a private touchstone. In moments of doubt, when a lead collapsed or a case stalled, they thought of the decades it had taken to solve that one crime. It tempered despair without erasing it. It did not promise success, but it justified persistence. The idea that work done today might matter long after they moved on became a source of motivation, a way to frame effort as an investment rather than a gamble. The solved cold case also changed how failure was understood. An unsolved case was no longer seen solely as an endpoint. It became a state, potentially temporary, shaped by context rather than finality. This shift did not eliminate the pain of unresolved crimes, but it reframed it, allowing space for hope that was grounded rather than naive. The past, the case suggested, is not inert. It can be reactivated when conditions change. In the public imagination, the case slowly settled into a category reserved for stories that alter perception. It was no longer headline news, but it was remembered, referenced when discussions turned to the reach of modern science or the patience of justice. People spoke about it with a sense of gravity, as something that had expanded the boundaries of what seemed possible. It became a marker, a before and after reference point in conversations about crime and accountability. Despite all this, the core truth remained stubbornly human. At the center of every discussion, every policy shift, every academic debate was a life interrupted. The victim was not an abstract symbol, though the case often became one. She was a person whose absence had shaped decades of effort and emotion. The solved cold case did not restore her presence, but preserved her significance, ensuring that her story did not dissolve into statistics or theory. In quiet moments, those closest to the case sometimes wondered what might have happened if technology had advanced sooner, if the DNA had spoken earlier. These questions were natural, inevitable, and ultimately unanswerable. They hovered at the edges of reflection, acknowledged but not indulged. The reality was fixed. The timeline could not be rewritten. All that remained was to understand it, to carry it forward in a way that honored both truth and restraint. The case continued to ripple outward, influencing decisions made far from its origin, by people who knew it only through summaries and secondhand accounts. Its reach extended beyond geography, embedding itself in a shared understanding of how justice can evolve. It reminded everyone who encountered it that time does not erase responsibility, that silence is not absolution, and that patience, though costly, can sometimes yield clarity. Even now, long after the verdict, the California 1994 cold case refuses to fade completely. It exists in a space between history and presence, resolved yet still resonant. It is invoked not with urgency, but with respect, as a story that reshaped expectations without offering easy comfort. In its endurance, it continues to ask a quiet question of anyone who hears it. What does it mean to wait for the truth? And what are we willing to preserve so that one day waiting might finally end? The longer the case existed in its resolved state, the more it began to behave like a living thing, adapting to the contexts in which it was remembered. It was no longer anchored solely to a crime scene or a courtroom transcript. It moved through conversations, policies, and private reflections, reshaping itself depending on who invoked it and why. The California 1994 cold case had crossed a threshold where resolution did not mean rest. Instead, it entered a phase of perpetual relevance, an artifact of justice that refused to stay confined to the past. For law enforcement leaders, the case became a quiet benchmark, something referenced not in press releases, but in internal deliberations. When budgets were debated and priorities questioned, its name surfaced indirectly. This is why we preserve evidence. This is why we revisit old files. This is why we resist the temptation to declare something impossible. It wasn't used as a slogan. It was used as a reminder, subtle but effective, that patience could be operationalized, that waiting did not have to mean neglect. Cold case units across the state felt the shift. Files once considered archival were pulled down and reassessed with fresh eyes. Investigators trained to expect immediacy learned to tolerate delay, to think in spans of years rather than weeks. The solved case validated that approach, giving institutional cover to work that might not pay off within a single career. It changed the internal culture in ways that were hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Persistence became less romanticized and more practical, grounded in the understanding that today's limits were temporary. Outside professional circles, the case continued to surface in quieter, more personal ways. It appeared in conversations between parents and teenagers, used not to frighten, but to contextualize. Bad things can happen, they would say, but sometimes answers come later. Much later, the story became a bridge between fear and realism, offering a narrative that acknowledged danger without surrendering to it. It taught patience without promising fairness. The media, having exhausted the immediate angles, began to revisit the case through retrospectives that emphasized time rather than shock. Long-form articles traced the arc from 1994 to the present, highlighting how incremental changes had accumulated into a breakthrough. These pieces avoided the language of miracle and instead focused on process, preservation, documentation, technological evolution. The solved cold case was framed not as an exception to the rule, but as evidence of what the rule could become under the right conditions. Yet even these thoughtful retellings struggled to capture the emotional texture of waiting. For the victim's family, time had never been abstract. It was felt in missed milestones, in unanswered phone calls, in the slow erosion of certainty. When they spoke now, years after the conviction, Their words carried a calm that had been earned, not assumed. They described grief as something that had settled into their bones, no longer sharp but always present. The truth had given it shape, but not relief. They spoke about how the solved cold case changed their relationship with memory. Before, every recollection had been accompanied by doubt, by the intrusive question of what they didn't know. After, memory became more stable, anchored to facts rather than speculation. That stability brought its own weight. There was no longer room for alternate explanations, no space to imagine different outcomes. The story was fixed, and they had to learn how to live alongside it. In the community, people began to notice how often the case was referenced in discussions about justice beyond its original scope. It came up in debates about statute limitations, about resource allocation, about the balance between privacy and public safety. The solved cold case had become a kind of currency, traded in arguments on all sides. Each reference carried an implicit acknowledgement of its power, of the way it had expanded what people believed was possible. At the same time, there was resistance to letting it become a symbol divorced from its origins. Some argued that elevating the case risked minimizing the countless others that remained unresolved. For every success story, they noted, there were families still waiting, evidence lost or degraded, trails gone cold beyond recovery. The solved case, in this view, was not a promise but an outlier, a reminder of unevenness rather than inevitability. This tension kept discussions honest, preventing the narrative from hardening into complacency. Technological progress continued to complicate the story. As DNA analysis became faster and more precise, expectations rose accordingly. The public began to ask why more cold cases weren't being solved, why breakthroughs didn't happen more often. The California 1994 case, once a beacon of hope, now carried the burden of comparison. Investigators pushed back gently, explaining that not all cases were equal, that preservation and circumstance mattered. The case taught possibility, not certainty. In classrooms, professors used the case to illustrate this nuance. Students were encouraged to see it not as a template to be replicated, but as a convergence of factors unlikely to align often. They studied the initial investigation, the years of dormancy, the eventual breakthrough, and the aftermath. They debated ethics, policy, and psychology, using the case as a grounding point. Through these discussions, the solved cold case gained a second life, educational rather than sensational. The convicted man, largely absent from public consciousness, remained a silent presence in these conversations. His existence challenged assumptions about behavior and detection. How could someone commit a violent crime and then recede into ordinary life without repetition? Analysts offered theories, none definitive. The case resisted closure at this level too, refusing to supply a neat psychological profile that could reassure anyone. It reminded observers that understanding motive is not a prerequisite for accountability. As years passed, anniversaries of the crime and of the conviction were marked with increasing restraint. There were no large gatherings, no dramatic statements. Remembrance became private, understated. A few flowers, a moment of silence. These gestures spoke to a maturation of grief, a recognition that public attention was no longer necessary for memory to persist. The solved cold case had moved from spectacle to legacy. For detectives who encountered the case only through training or secondhand accounts, it still carried emotional weight. They imagined what it must have been like to reopen a file that old, to see names written in fading ink, to trace decisions made by people long retired or gone. The case fostered a sense of continuity, a feeling that they were part of a chain extending backward and forward through time. Their work, they realized, might one day be re-examined by someone else, judged not by immediate success, but by durability. This awareness influenced how they approached evidence, how carefully they documented even the smallest details. The solved cold case had taught them that nothing is truly insignificant if it is preserved. A fiber, a note, a partial profile could one day become the missing piece. This mindset did not guarantee resolution, but it honored the possibility of it. Public trust in forensic science continued to evolve alongside this mindset. The case reinforced belief in DNA as an impartial witness, immune to memory and bias. But it also sparked conversations about over-reliance, about the need to contextualize scientific findings within broader investigative frameworks. The solved cold case became a cautionary tale against simplification, reminding people that science answers questions, but humans decide how to ask them. As the story receded further into the past, it paradoxically gained clarity. The chaos of the early days, the frustration of the middle years, and the shock of resolution settled into a coherent arc. This clarity did not diminish its impact. If anything, it made the lessons easier to see. Justice is not linear. Time is not neutral. Silence is not the end. The California 1994 cold case continued to exist in this layered state, resolved but not retired, finished but not forgotten. It occupied a space where history informs the present without dictating it, where one outcome reshapes expectations without defining them. It remained a touchstone, a reminder that the past is not static, that it can be revisited, reinterpreted, and sometimes, finally, understood. And as long as there were unanswered questions elsewhere, as long as evidence sat waiting in storage rooms and families waited for calls that had not yet come, the case would continue to resonate. Not as a promise, not as a guarantee, but as proof that waiting, though costly, is not always in vain. Time did not soften the edges of the California 1994 cold case, so much as it changed the way those edges cut. What once felt like an open wound gradually became a scar, visible, permanent, and strangely instructive. People no longer spoke about the case with urgency alone, but with a measured awareness of how long truth can take to surface and how fragile it remains even after it does. The shock of the DNA breakthrough faded, replaced by something heavier and more complex: reflection. In quiet moments, investigators who had inherited the case late in their careers admitted that its resolution altered their relationship with doubt. They learned to live with uncertainty not as a failure, but as a condition of the work. For decades, the file had been defined by what it lacked. No suspect, no clear motive, no reliable witness. Solving it did not erase those absences. It reframed them. Each missing piece was no longer proof of futility, but evidence of endurance, a reminder that absence can coexist with eventual clarity. The evidence itself, now cataloged and sealed as part of a completed case, took on a different meaning. Items once handled with desperation were now treated with reverence. The biological samples that led to the DNA match were studied in training environments, not for their technical complexity, but for their survival. They had outlasted technology, policy changes, and human attention. They became symbols of restraint, proof that sometimes the most important investigative decision is to wait. The case also forced a reckoning with memory. Witnesses who had spoken in 1994 had long since reshaped their recollections, consciously or not. Some had moved away. Some had died. Others remembered the crime through layers of retelling, news coverage, and speculation. When the case was solved, their memories were no longer required to carry the weight of truth. DNA had spoken where memory faltered. This shift unsettled some and relieved others, underscoring the tension between human narrative and scientific certainty. In the broader legal community, the case became a quiet argument against haste. Prosecutors revisited it when discussing charging decisions, evidence thresholds, and the risks of proceeding without sufficient support. Defense attorneys cited it in debates about wrongful convictions, pointing out how easily pressure and incomplete information could have produced a different outcome in 1994. The solved cold case occupied both sides of the courtroom, reminding each that justice is not owned by speed. Public interest waned in the way it always does, gradually, unevenly. The headlines stopped. The documentary slowed. But the case never fully disappeared. It resurfaced whenever another decades-old crime made the news, whenever DNA databases expanded, whenever a long-forgotten suspect was named. The California 1994 cold case became a reference point, a mental yardstick against which new stories were measured. Could this one also wait 20, 30 years for an answer? For the victim's family, the passage of time after resolution brought a different challenge. Closure, they learned, was not a finish line, but a plateau. The answers they had waited for arrived, but they did not move life forward in the way outsiders imagined. Instead, they stabilized it. The constant motion of not knowing stopped. In its place was stillness, and stillness required adjustment. Grief, once fueled by uncertainty, now had to exist on its own. They spoke privately about how the solved cold case changed their sense of identity. For years, they had been defined by the unanswered question, by the role of waiting. After the conviction, that role dissolved. They were no longer advocates for attention, no longer petitioners for justice. They were simply people with a loss, one now documented and explained. The relief was real, but so was the emptiness it left behind. In law enforcement training rooms, instructors emphasized this human cost. They spoke not only about the triumph of the DNA match, but about the decades of silence that preceded it. Recruits were taught to see cold cases not as dormant files, but as ongoing relationships with the past. Each decision to preserve or discard evidence, to document or ignore a lead, was framed as a message to the future. The solved case made that future visible. The technology that unlocked the case continued to evolve, raising new questions. If DNA could solve a crime after 25 years, what else might become possible? Facial recognition, genetic genealogy, predictive analytics. Each innovation promised more answers, but also more ethical dilemmas. The California 1994 cold case was often cited in these discussions, not as justification, but as caution. Power, it reminded people, must be matched with restraint. Some critics worry that the case had created unrealistic expectations. Families of unsolved crimes asked why their cases were still waiting. Communities demanded action, invoking the solved cold case as precedent. Officials responded carefully, explaining limitations, managing hope. The case had opened a door, but it had not widened the hallway. Its uniqueness had to be preserved even as its lessons were shared. As years passed, the physical spaces associated with the crime changed. Buildings were renovated. Streets were renamed. The original crime scene bore no visible trace of what had happened there. Only those who knew the story could see the ghost of it, layered beneath fresh paint and new purpose. The solved cold case existed independently of place now, detached from geography, sustained by record and memory. Journalists who revisited the story years later noted this dislocation. They wrote about how time had absorbed the crime into the landscape, how ordinary life had reclaimed the space. Their articles were quieter, less dramatic, focused on aftermath rather than action. The tone reflected a collective understanding that some stories are not meant to be relived endlessly, only remembered accurately. The convicted individual remained largely unseen, his presence reduced to legal documents and institutional routine. There were no public statements, no attempts to reshape the narrative. His silence became part of the case's texture, another unanswered element that resolution did not require. Accountability had been established. Explanation was optional. In academic circles, the case inspired research into long-term investigations. Scholars examined how organizational memory is preserved, how files survive transitions, how attention can be sustained across generations of personnel. The California 1994 cold case featured prominently in these studies, valued not for its drama, but for its continuity. It demonstrated that systems, like people, can remember if designed to do so. Ultimately, the case settled into a paradoxical state. It was complete, yet still active. Finished, yet still instructive. Its story no longer unfolded, but continued to echo. Each echo carried a different lesson depending on who heard it. For some, it was proof that justice can wait. For others, a warning about how long it sometimes does. And so the solved cold case endured, not as a moment frozen in time, but as a process extended across decades. It lived in evidence rooms and lecture halls, in family homes and policy debates. It refused to be simplified into a moral or a slogan. It asked instead for patience, humility, and attention. Because beneath every solved case lies the shadow of those still unresolved. Beneath every breakthrough is the question of timing. And beneath every answer is the quiet knowledge that truth does not arrive on demand. It arrives when conditions allow, when preservation meets possibility, when the past is finally ready to speak. The California 1994 cold case had spoken at last. Not loudly, not all at once, but clearly enough to be heard and remembered long after the noise faded. By the time the California 1994 cold case reached its third decade after resolution, it had settled into the background hum of institutional memory, no longer invoked with astonishment, but with a kind of sober respect. It had become less a story about a single crime and more a lens through which people examine time itself, how it stretches, how it conceals, how it eventually reveals. The case no longer belonged to the moment it was solved. It belonged to every moment that followed, quietly reshaping expectations. Inside evidence facilities, technicians still referenced it without ceremony. When discussing chain of custody protocols or environmental controls, someone would mention that case, not by name, but by implication. Remember what lasted. Remember what survived. The lesson was not abstract. It was tactile, grounded in the reality that a single preserved sample had carried the weight of truth across generations. That awareness altered how hands moved, how labels were checked, how doors were locked at the end of the day. Investigators who joined cold case units years later described an initial uneasy